Hello, grade 12s. This is a presentation about occupied territories and resistance in World War II. It's from, with reference to Chapter 10, the Home Front in Occupied Europe, and Nazi Occupation and Resistance, which is part of your homework. So, what was life like under Nazi occupation? Some of you may recognize this building. We'll see that later. There were work camps, there were extermination camps, and things could be pretty brutal. In response, one might wonder what the resistance was like that took place. And here we can see two sets of resistance groups. That's not a German resistance fighter, rather someone who's fighting the Germans and wearing a captured helmet. So the forms that resistance would take included hiding Jewish people and other foreign nationals or nationals who were at risk, refusing to buy German goods, armed resistance, sabotaging production in terms of sending materials or in terms of factories, sometimes even open rebellions, that's what those pictures were from, and urban fighting. They also were involved in spy networks, assisting both the Soviets and the Western Allies. And something as simple as resistance could be listening to foreign radio stations and thinking the way the German occupiers didn't want you to think. Now in Poland, and here we can see those resistance fighters that I talked about, the armed rebellion. Above us from the picture above is from the Warsaw Uprising in '44. Which saw 63 days of heavy fighting, and that's a poster saying "Rise Up." Here we can see some of the fighters. In Poland, they had a home army known the AK, the Armia Krajowa. They were active throughout the war. That'll be a multiple choice question, by the way. What was the AK and what country were they from? They're from Poland. They operated spy networks. They disrupted supply convoys. And then near the end of the war, as the Soviet troops were arriving, they rose up and were determined to free Warsaw on their own. And they saw 63 days of heavy fighting against the German occupiers. There was no aid at all from the nearby Soviets. Stalin and his commanders said they needed to stop and restock, but it was more believed that they just wanted the resistance fighters, 15,000 in the end died, to be wiped out by the Germans so that they wouldn't have to deal with them when they came and occupied the country of Poland after the war. In addition, during that rising, another 225,000 civilians were killed as the city of Warsaw was leveled by the Nazis. Overall in the war, it's estimated that 150,000 Axis soldiers were killed by the Polish Home Army, and that they kept another 900,000 busy as occupation troops who couldn't be involved in fighting on other fronts. Today, their memory is remembered, and here we can see a picture of veterans marching at a memorial parade, and one could even imagine that those four there across the line, the tall gentleman in the white, the lady behind him, were the four people in the picture above from the Warsaw Uprising. Other groups that were involved, there were Jewish partisan groups that resisted in Warsaw when the ghetto was being set up. There were other ones. There's a whole movie called Defiance, set up in the woods of Poland. There were multiple groups in Yugoslavia, the Chetniks, the Yugoslav partisans under Tito, who was a ruthless leader in fighting the Germans and later a ruthless dictator in his own country. France also had partisan groups, one known as the Maquis, after a tough area to travel through in parts of France, the Maquis. And by 1943, there were 500 attacks on railways each month, which would, of course, disrupt supplies. And they also aided during D-Day. And it's interesting here, this is a painting by a British war artist of a Maquis group that he made in '44. And one might wonder why this gentleman here, whose nickname was Tito, he was the leader of this group of the Maquis, of French resistance, why he's wearing a key. Let's find out. Gross, the artist, arranged to do a series of drawings of the local Maquis. He was taken into the Brittany countryside to meet the resistance group at their farm headquarters. This work records La Campagne de Tito of the Colic Maquis, standing in an orchard. The leader is wearing a key of the prison of Lannon around his neck, from which he and other members, probably in the picture, rescued 11 of their number the night before they were to be executed. And you can see here, predominantly men, but there are female Maquis fighters, and this was typical of resistance movements across Europe. There were men and women involved in resisting the German occupation. Now, in the Soviet Union, we can see here a picture of partisans moving along, walking. Here's a heroic picture, which actually looks similar to some of the pictures from Lord of the Rings, of a partisan group operating behind the lines in Russia. And what you need to know is that the partisans in the USSR were actually, in many cases, ordered men and women. They were ordered to stay behind and slow the German advance. The German advance was also so rapid in Barbarossa that thousands of Russian troops were left behind the lines. And I guess many of them chose to fight, one, to resist the occupation of the Germans, but also if they didn't fight and surrendered, when they were repatriated as POWs, they might be killed by their own Soviet forces or sent to prison camps. The Soviet partisans, by the end of 1942, over 300,000 partisans existed and had led many attacks. In particular, they bombed and disrupted the flow of supplies, as well as killing German officers and civilian collaborators. And it must also be remembered that while they were ordered to stay behind, many of those who were partisans were Communist Party officials, officers, people from minority groups like Jewish minority groups who would have been killed out of hand by the Nazis anyway. So that's another strong motivator to fight. In the Ukraine, it's interesting. The Ukraine being distinct from Russia, the Ukrainian partisans, the UNO, fought both the Germans and the Soviet partisans. They saw both as occupiers, and in a sense, there was a civil war going on in the Ukraine behind the lines. By 1944, however, this civil war had ended, and the Ukrainian partisans had been crushed as Stalin reestablished his order. Again, that's a multiple choice question. Where did partisans fight partisans? And that's in Russia, and that's false, because partisans fought each other in Ukraine. Finally, a summary of the different activities of the partisans. You can see here they organized labor strikes and sabotaged war production. They reported Axis activity to the Allies. They destroyed Axis supplies and infrastructure, particularly important in Russia where the supply lines were so long. They assassinated Axis officials and civilians who cooperated with the Axis powers. They created and fought civil wars in Italy, Yugoslavia, and the Ukraine. They rescued Jews and others, and in some cases they even formed their own armies to fight the Axis, as in Poland and in Yugoslavia. Now, imprisonment and extermination. We've talked about the Holocaust before in class, and many of you have studied it. Just so you know, for the multiple choice, this is the train entrance to Auschwitz, which will be a multiple choice question. And you know that the Holocaust was predated by the Nuremberg laws in Germany and the hate that Hitler and the Nazis had for the Jewish people. At first, after 1939, there were the ghettos in Poland where there was starvation occurring and other terrible treatment by the Nazis of the Jewish people. But it was in the invasion of Russia where the Nazis just started killing whole Jewish villages as they invaded, that the policies appeared to be changing, and by 1942 they had a plan for work in death camps. There were Jews, Roma, POWs, opponents, and in the end, millions and millions of people were executed by the Nazis, and in particular, 90% of the Polish Jewish population was wiped out. For POWs, Germany did not treat its POWs on the Eastern Front much better. Of the 6 million Soviet soldiers believed to have been captured, 3 million died in Nazi hands. 1 due to neglect, 2 also due to they just were not prepared for those kinds of numbers. And then as the war stretched on, they just didn't have the resources to maintain them, nor in many cases probably did they want to. The irony is, of those 3 million who survived internment with the Germans, they would then face, upon repatriation, either being shot as deserters or put into prison camps by their own people. In terms of the USSR, capturing prisoners, they'd captured 3 million, and before 1943, when things were particularly grim in the Soviet Union, of course they couldn't feed their own people, let alone prisoners. And they did treat the German prisoners very, very harshly when they captured them. It must be noted, though, that Germany, their treatment of prisoners varied depending on the country of origin and your ethnic origin. Jewish and African Americans in particular were often shot out of hand, whereas Western prisoners were treated much better for the most part. There'll be some homework with the Nazi occupation, the resistance, and you'll just see some of the terrible punishments the Nazis handed out in occupied areas for resistance activities as well. That ends the presentation.